Good morning, friends. Thanks for stopping by the channel, and as the title is suggesting, coffee and a book review. Like fire and powder. I want to start off by thanking my friend William Broken Feather for recently sending me this book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. I can't say that everything in here was new to me. Some of the stuff that I've read in here was stuff that was alluded to many decades ago in some of the earlier muzzleloader magazines and things like that. But there are some things in here that I would like to read, and hopefully I won't cross the line of reading too much. But I do want to share some of my thoughts in this regard and kind of take a second look at maybe the way I determine whether my gunpowder, homemade gunpowder, is clean or dirty, or how does it really all compare. The author, Brett Gibbons, in the front tells you what his credentials are and the reasons why he decided to make his own gunpowder. And like a lot of us many years ago, black powder was definitely difficult to get. I know for me personally, I haven't had to buy gunpowder in a very long time, because most of the time I ended up winning my gunpowder, my black powder, at Mountain Man Rendezvous. So for me, having black powder available wasn't really a concern, and I elected to start making it for myself just simply because the cost of black powder started getting really ridiculous. And when GoX went out of business, I recognized right there and then it was going to be even more difficult to get black powder, even on prize blankets, which is what I have seen, over the years. Schutzen was pretty easy to get, but it was still, somewhat expensive. But anyhow, what I'd like to do is just share a few thoughts from the book, and then I'll get out and do some test burns, because he references some information that was written by by a Captain Smith back in the day. What he observed, how they were making gunpowder back in the day. And as most of us have come to recognize, black powder really hasn't changed. Except for maybe what I would consider terminology. Okay, for instance, 3FG. The G doesn't stand for graphite. It stands for glazed. We know. That's a moot point this day and age. But when you really look at what he explains in here, maybe we should be encouraging the gunpowder manufacturers to go 3FP, polished, because that's all it really is. It's just polished gunpowder. And he does, and I'll read it, he does go in here and explain that Swiss does use a graphite coating, along with most of your other commercial black powder producers. But I'll read that in a little bit. Now, one thing that I found very interesting in this book is it's acknowledged, and we should all acknowledge it ourselves, that black powder is not the most efficient burning gunpowders available. It's very inefficient. Now let me show you what he points to here on page 36. He's got a chart up here, and you also have to realize too that he makes a clear distinction between buckthorn alder. He really says buckthorn alder is not really an alder, it's more of a dogwood, if I remember correctly, okay? But he lists dogwood first in place of buckthorn alder. Now what he's pointing to is the amount of gases that are produced in a given charge, okay? and that portion of gas is measured in cubic inches, okay? So the dogwood or the buckthorn alder produces 80 to 84 cubic inches of gases and a prescribed amount of black powder burning. So you can see that there's still approximately 20% of that black powder, even with buckthorn alder, that's not being consumed. And in fact, if you guys really want to see how this works, go to the channel Black Powder Maniac Shooter. He just put up a video real recently. The title of the video is Shooting with Bethany, Cash or Cry Challenge. Now, I've watched several of this man's videos, and he loves Swiss black powder. And you'll even hear him say Swiss is the best. But look at when Bethany shoots Swiss out of that long gun. Look at the front of the barrel. You can see the powder coming out and burning as it's falling to the ground. That's a waste of money, because you're not burning that in the barrel of your gun. It is in essence being pushed out and burning as it falls to the ground. So is it really the most efficient? You know, even though Swiss right here states Swiss black powder has long been considered the best in black powder due to the long tradition of powder production dedicated to quality in components and workmanship. Well, there's only 3 components: potassium nitrate, your charcoal source, and sulfur. So, to me, this is extremely misleading when you take into account that only 80 to 84% of it is produced in the gases that you need to propel that projectile. Once again, go watch that video and watch the amount of powder that's coming out of the front of that long gun that's falling to the ground. You're not burning that inside your gun barrel, and that's Swiss, okay? Now, I want to move on to the next one in the line, Willow. Now, my friend and I, William Broken Feather, we've been discussing about using Pacific Willow, because this author mentions Pacific Willow is the second best to buckthorn alder as far as the consumption and the amount of cubic inches of gases that it produces. Okay, so second in line is Willow, and I'm going to interject, he doesn't say it, but it has to be Pacific Willow. Okay, that produces cubic inches of 76 to 78. Okay, that's the portion of gas that is actually being developed in your powder charge to push that projectile forward. Okay, next in line below that is your alder. Now, I've done videos and I've shown that even when it comes to the alder family, there are different levels of specific gravity. But just generally speaking, the cubic inches of gas produced by an alder is 74 to 73. So it's definitely less efficient. Now, when Swiss and other people say that they use buckthorn alder because it's the most consistent with the burn rate, I don't actually buy that terminology. I want to look at that from, well, it consistently produces the most amount of gas, but it doesn't mean that it is that much more efficient, okay? Because my chronograph shows that when I tested Swiss 3F, I got a spread of 105 feet difference between the high and the low. And when I remilled the Swiss and get rid of that graphite, I lowered that spread, okay? And even my peanut shell with a 5-shot average may not produce the same amount of feet per second as the same charge with Swiss, but I got a spread of 34. So when you look at it from that perspective, which one really has a more consistent burn rate, if that's how you want to, you know, term it, use that terminology, okay? So then he goes down to Filbert, which is 72. Now the interesting thing is he's got chestnut, hazel, elm. And elm only produces 61 to 63 cubic inches of gas in that prescribed amount of powder. Okay, it's got mahogany in there. And now this is interesting because he's got willow. And right next to willow, he's got in parentheses towards the bottom, overheated. He makes a good point in here about not overcharring your charcoal, which is what I've, stated on this channel many times. You can overchar it. And his conclusion is based on the fact that some of the resins, some of the creosote, which in my opinion would still be a resin, needs to be left behind because that helps facilitate a better burn, a cleaner burn. That's him, not me. But I find it interesting that the willow, overheated or overcooked, only produces something from, now look at the wide range, from 59 to 66 cubic inches of gas in that portion of whatever that measurement of gunpowder is. So willow's not the best. Now what my peanut shell produces as far as the gas, the cubic inches of gas in any given portion, I don't have any way of measuring that. All I can do is look at what it does through my chronograph. And again, outside that first shot, going down a clean barrel, all my gunpowders, whether they're clean or dirty, manage to fall within like a 750 to 1750 to 1800 feet per second. So I thought I would share that with you, just simply because, two reasons. The reason why buckthorn alder, dogwood, is considered is because it does produce the most volume of gas per cubic inches in a prescribed burn. So that's something that you might want to keep in mind, okay? So the next thing that I want to point out is the portions of your mixtures, okay? Now for a long time I've gone 75, 15, 11. Now for the benefit of a conversation that I recently had with my friend William Broken Feather, I mentioned that my formula is in truth 76, 15, 11. And then he asked me, how long have I been going 76? Well, I've been going 76 for a very long time, but I've only qualified it as 75. So let me take this moment to explain, okay? When I first started making black powder, I was watching a lot of guys that were making black powder to repack those little model rocket engines. And 90% of those videos encouraged you drying out your potassium nitrate so that any moisture left behind would not affect the way that charcoal or that gunpowder would burn in your engines, your model rocket engines. So what I did a very long time ago is I took 75 grams of potassium nitrate and I put it on a tray and I put it in the dashboard of my truck for 2 hours. Then I measured the weight loss and I recorded that. Put it back on my dashboard for another hour. Once again, measured the loss of weight. Okay? Because we all have come to understand that it's 75 grams, which is a weight, 15 grams, which is a weight, 10 grams, which is a weight. That weight can change depending on the amount of moisture that may or may not be left behind in your potassium nitrate. So after going through that process, once I determined how much weight was actually lost by drying it out beforehand, I took 70, and it ended up being 1 gram by weight. So I took 76 grams of potassium nitrate, put it on the same tray, and I left it in the on the dashboard for about 2-3 hours, whatever it was, because I did this a long time ago. I've slept once or twice since then, and I've drunk a whole lot of coffee since then too. But once I did that, took that 76 grams, put it in the dashboard and dried it out, and re-weighed that, it was right at about 75 grams dry weight. Okay, so either way you look at it, if you dry it out or not dry it out, it's really not going to affect the end product. Let me show you. So I want to read what he has here as far as portions are considered. Okay, so by the atomic weight, he's got saltpeter listed at 74.64 grams. Okay, charcoal 13.51 grams, sulfur 11.83 grams. Now he has another category here in the United States, okay, for military service. Whoops. For military service. One of the formulas that they use is 76-14-10. A gram more, like mine, is 76 by weight. Because by the time you dry it out, it gets right back down to about that 75. Another military service is 75-15-10. Okay, now here's the difference. For sporting black powder, 78-12-10. Another sporting formula, 77-13-10. Where have I heard that before? Did somebody really come up with that on their own, or did they read it out of a book and, hey, guess what, guys? This is the best. I digress. Now in England, there's a difference. In England, military service was just strictly 75-15-10. Sporting, 75-17-8. How about in France? Military service, 75, 12.5, and 12.5. So you can see that when people on YouTube say you have to have 100%, 75-15-10 is 100%. Or, 100 grams. That's not consistent across the world and or militaries. It's not consistent. So those proportions can be played around with. But to settle on one as being the most efficient is not always necessarily true. Okay? Now in France, the sporting formula was 78-12-10. How about in Prussia? For the military service, 75-13.5 and 11.5. And in Spain, military service, 76.5, 12.7, 10.8. So I think we can appreciate that our formulas do not have to necessarily be 75-15-10. You can vary those, okay? Which is what I've known for a very long time already, because decades ago, even though there wasn't a lot published, but decades ago I was reading stuff similar to this in muzzleloader magazines. Okay, now I want to move on to something else that I found very interesting. So I'm going to read a little bit. Hopefully I won't get any copyright. But he writes a little bit about what kind of media to use. There is a lot of discussion and controversy over what milling media to use. While I think there is plenty of room for debate over the best milling media for non-energetic mixtures, I am absolutely convinced that only lead media be used when milling any quantity of black powder. I also think anyone who mills black powder with anything other than lead is taking an unacceptable risk. Well, that's an opinion. On this point, I don't think there is any room for compromise, okay? Now, let me see if I can find the next point I want to bring out. I have used 3 types of milling media. For milling the ingredients separately or in a non-energetic binary mixture, I have used brass and steel balls. So if you're not quite familiar with what he's talking about, is that, and I'll explain what he does, is he makes a large portion of gunpowder at one time. So he takes half of that portion, such as the potassium nitrate and maybe the charcoal, and he mixes that by itself without the sulfur, the energy that's provided by the sulfur. And then he mixes a little bit of the charcoal with the sulfur, mixes that separately, and then when he's ready to combine everything, that's when he uses the lead media. So that's what he's expressing here, okay? I have used brass and steel balls. As I just mentioned, for mixing the combined ingredients, I only use hardened antimony lead shot. Now, isn't that what I've been saying for the course of my doing black powder? I use lead media, but my lead media is 60-40. For every 60 pounds of lead, there's 40 pounds of tin, which makes that lead media very, very hard. Now, the reason why there's a lot of room for discussion, because everybody talks about, your gunpowder being dirty because of the lead dust being left behind. Your gunpowder is dirty because of the rubber you're taking off of the side of your rubber container if you're mixing in a rubber container. So there's a lot of room for discussion here. Okay, so going on, my lead and steel balls are 1/2 inch, and the brass is various size, but more or less 1/2 inch in average. Okay, now, because of what he mentioned right here, 1/2 inch, I decided to change the way I do my milling, and I haven't milled anything yet because I'm just at the beginning stages. When I first started learning to make black powder, everybody on the internet said use a variety of sizes so that way you get a more complete mix. So, put some, 380s in there, put some, 490s, 534s, get a variety so that it just mixes up better. Well, is that really true? If this gentleman is only using stuff in 1/2 inch size, then that's good enough for me. But I do want to make this point. I did this 2 days ago. I emptied out all my media and I measured a large variety of my 380, 0.380, and a large variety of my 0.530. Okay, this is what I found. Now bear in mind as I go through this, how many hours upon hours I've done in milling my black powder. Because as I said, as of right now, I've never changed out my media from day one. Okay, now on all the 380s, I found on average 4/1000ths of an inch smaller in diameter. So I have left behind, and I'll grant you this, some lead powder. But how much is 4/1000ths over all the hours? You see this piece of paper? This piece of paper is only 4/1000ths of an inch thick. That's how much lead dust I've left behind in all those hours and all that gunpowder that I've made. Is it really contaminating your gunpowder, as some like to argue? Honestly, look at how thick that piece of paper is. 4/1000ths. Now on my 530s, on an average, I only lost 3/1000ths of an inch. And what is 3/1000ths? That thinness. Over all those hours, have I really contaminated the gunpowder as much as some people like to bemoan about? I don't think so. So bear that in mind. But once again, my media, my lead media is a 60-40 ratio. 60 pounds of lead to every 40 pounds of tin. So what I've done is I went ahead and recast all that lead into all 530 round ball. And there again, since the 530 round ball does weigh heavier than what the 380 round ball does, I'm expecting, only time will tell, that I might be able to get a quicker mill time out of it now, because I'm using the same amount, I'm using the same amount of weight consistently, blending up that gunpowder. Okay. Now something else that I do want to mention here real quick in this. Moving on to the portion of binary mixtures. For milling the binary mixtures, I have used brass, bronze, and steel media. I still feel safer using brass, as I do have some concerns about small bits of steel being broken away from the steel media, which could end up in the mixture and potentially causing a spark when milling the combined charge. However, the brass wears faster. What? Say what? However, the brass wears faster. You'll find that on page 69. And is much more expensive than steel media. Obviously, any media material that wears off during the milling process is added in the mixture and represents an impurity. It is frustrating to have gone to the lengths to achieve an absolute purity of ingredients. Okay, now let me explain this to you. What I read earlier. This gentleman goes and purifies all of his potassium nitrate. Even if he buys it packaged 100% pure, he still takes the added time to repurify that and make sure that he's got 100% pure potassium nitrate. Okay? But even in the milling process, even if you use brass, you can still contaminate it. But I'm going to expand upon that a little bit further, because I want to really emphasize, is it really worth your time to purify your potassium nitrate? Okay? So he has a section in here on pressing your gunpowder. Now, the industry, as I pointed out before, the industry standard is, what is it, 1.72 to 1.82. His gunpowder is pressed to 1.55. And he claims that it's even cleaner burning and more efficient at 1.55. Okay, cubic inches per centimeter. So that's something to bear in mind for those that like to leave comments saying, well, you know, your gunpowder is weak because you're not pressing it to industry standards. But there again, 75, 15, 10 is a military standard. And that could change whether you're in the United States or France. The sporting standard is a little bit different, as I read earlier. All right, now I want to go on to the finale. Referring to the writings of this Captain Smith, this is what he writes. Captain Smith acknowledged that graphite coating gives a fine silvery surface to the grain, but warns that graphite is really an impurity. So you spend all that time purifying your potassium nitrate to tumble it with graphite, and now you're interjecting an impurity, graphite. Going on, and therefore it should be sparingly applied to powder. It is never used with any of the fine small arms powders, but only with powders intended to be used in large charges, and with the express intention of giving them a surface which will, if anything, retard rather than quicken the ignition. I've asked a comment on this channel, does it seem like my homemade gunpowder ignites quicker, especially when it's in my flintlock? Just for emphasis, which will, if anything, retard rather than quicken the ignition. A great deal of inferior blasting powder is sold nowadays polished with black lead to a high degree of brilliancy. But it is needless to remark that the luster it possesses is no test of quality. Graphite glazing is sometimes defended as other layers of protection against powder absorbing moisture from the air, which to some extent is probably true. In other words, he doesn't know for sure, but powder is still hygroscopic with or without a graphite coating, and the only real permanent solution to keeping powder dry is to keep it well sealed against the atmosphere. I have no interest in pretty looking shiny powder. My interest is strictly in performance. And since Waltham Abbey, which is the plant that he's referring to here back in the day, did not add any graphite to RFG. Now that's a specific powder in itself, and you'd have to read the book to be able to put that in context. I don't use any graphite either, okay? But I want to backtrack just a little bit. The paragraph prior. A note about graphite glazing. I don't do it because RFG powder was not graphite glazed at Waltham Abbey. Larger grain powder for military was graphite glazed, however. See, again, they do add graphite to it. For those that say Swiss doesn't, I'm going to read further on, okay? So even back in the day, they graphite glazed some of their gunpowders, but not for small arms. Okay? He goes on to say, by graphite glazed, I mean that a small amount of graphite, 1/2 of an ounce of graphite for every 100 pounds of gunpowder, was added to the glazing barrels when the powder was tumbled. It coats the grains in a very thin layer of graphite. And I have to say, it makes the grains shiny and very attractive to look at. Swiss black powder is highly graphite glazed. Now, how many times have I read that on this channel? Right here. Black powder is made entirely with all the buckthorn charcoal with a heavy graphite glazing. Again, you have to understand that there are some people out there that still bemoan Swiss does not graphite their gunpowder, but yet this author recognizes they do. In reading from Captain Smith's writings, decades upon decades ago, he viewed graphite as a contaminant. So you spend all this time purifying your KNO3 just to put a graphite coating which adds to the contaminants of your gunpowder. Doesn't make much sense to me. Okay? Swiss black powder is highly graphite glazed. And it is really beautiful stuff that pours and measures smoothly while bright and shimmering. In the mid-19th century, however, inferior qualities of commercially produced gunpowders were often given a bright graphite coating to raise the perception that it was a high grade of powder. Once again, graphite is a contaminant, just like the undesirable impurities in the potassium nitrate or the lead from the milling process. Graphite also raises the ignition temperature of gunpowder and makes it harder and slower to ignite. For use in artillery pieces, slower ignition is desirable, and graphite coating gave the cannon powder this desired property. Now, do you understand in full context that graphite is really a contaminant for what we're doing today outside of the military service? Now, does the military today still use gunpowder? Absolutely 100%. All their battleships that have those turrets with those guns, those are all blasted with gunpowder. Every single one of those those cannons are ignited and fired their projectiles with black powder. So they still use it today, and they want that heavy graphite glazing. Why? Because it slows down the ignition, and if you have a slower ignition and it slows down the burning rate, then that gives the gases inside a pre-measured charge a little greater chance to become gas instead of just being blown out the front of your barrels. But hey, what do I know, right? I've only been doing this since my teens, shooting black powder, but I really don't know much of anything. Now I want to backtrack a little bit about Pacific Willow, okay? And I pulled this off of the website, Specific Gravity of Pacific Willow. Pacific Willow is one of the many species of willow. And like other willows, its wood is considerably lightweight. Different sources provide varying but generally consistent information on the specific gravity and density of willow wood. One source indicates that willow wood in general has a specific gravity range of 0.34 to 0.41. That's quite a bit of range if you're using this to make black powder. You're going to get varying speeds and varying data, okay? Another source lists the specific gravity with a 12% moisture content for willow as 0.034 to 0.040, while others list at 0.53, or average dried weight of 400 kilograms, equivalent to the specific gravity of approximately 0.40. Okay. Factors affecting specific gravity. Specific gravity is a measure of density, and I've showed those in my glass jars over the years that I've been showing everybody my method of making homemade black powder. And it's important to remember that wood density and consequently specific gravity can be affected by factors like the amount of linen in the cells, how densely the cells are packed, and the number of air spaces within the cell. In addition, moisture content also plays a significant role in wood density and specific gravity. Okay, so the author here talks a little bit about drying your wood. Depending on where you live, like where I live, I can dry out a chunk of my wood, say juniper, within a matter of a couple of months, whereas what led me to view specific gravity in the choices of wood is when the fellow from Hoffman Reproduction read from some leaked information regarding Swiss and the factory that they season their alder buckthorn for 3 years. That's when it's like, oh, specific gravity does make a difference. It really does. So anyhow, what I'm going to do now, and I want to thank you for following along this far, I'm going to test some of my black powders, retest them. Because as he writes in the book, that back in the day when they tested to see how good or efficient your black powder truly does burn, they tested an amount on clear glass. Now for the long time you guys have all been seeing me test all my gunpowders on a block of wood. Okay, with the exception this time for the brevity of the rest of this video, I'm going to put 20 grains in a pile and I'm going to use my torch to set it off because I want to look at what it truly does. And I'm going to start off with Swiss as the baseline since everybody thinks Swiss is the best of the best. Okay, but once again, if you've missed it, go to the channel Black Powder Maniac Shooting, and the title of the video is Shooting with Bethany, Cash or Cry Challenge. And look at the amount of that Swiss that's coming out of the front of that barrel and being consumed or burnt as it's being dropped to the ground. That's not burning inside your gun barrel, producing the gases necessary to get great volume. But I'm going to go out here and we'll see by comparison how all this works. 20 grains of Swiss 3F. Okay, I'm going to try to give you a close-up so you can look through the glass and determine for yourself if you think this is clean or dirty gunpowder and how it might compare to everything else I'm going to be testing. So there's the clear glass. Make up your own mind. There's again 20 grains of Swiss, and you can look at the smoky residue. But one thing that I read as it relates to Captain Smith back in the day, what they were looking for is any type of impurities left behind, and he specifically mentions little white chunks. Well, I can tell you for a fact that there's little white chunks left behind. So according to his criteria, this would be dirty gunpowder. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and clean this off. You can take a look once again, make up your own mind. I know this is probably difficult to see, but it is what it is. All right, on to the next gunpowder. 20 grains of Willow, Weeping Willow. Give you a different position. I don't know if this is any better or not, but you could see that it's definitely, I don't know, maybe a little dirtier looking per se, but once again, focusing on what the criteria was, yeah, you guys can see I'm wiping away an awful lot of charcoal residue, obviously. So this is very dirty, but very dirty. But I have to concede that this Willow is when I first started making gunpowder, and I may have overcooked it, which I probably did, which would change how the Willow would burn. All right, let me move on to the next one. Okay, what's on the glass now is Juniper Red Cedar mixed. Now this red cedar that's blended with the juniper is the pet bedding, so there's a lot of sapwood, so I'm not sure how this is going to burn and what it's going to look like, because I've done a test back on this channel looking at the difference between pet bedding red cedar and heartwood red cedar, and there was a difference in it. All right, let's see what this does. So let's try a little different angle, because the sun's just right to be wrong. But there's the burn. You can see that there's quite a bit of smoky residue, but the minute pieces of KNO3 are barely visible. I mean, it looks to me like it was a very complete and thorough burn, but once again, rubbing it with the finger, you can see it's pretty dirty. And I'm not saying that this is solely because of the juniper by itself. I'm saying because I blended it with red cedar pet bedding, which had an awful lot of sapwood in it. But let's just continue on. So here's juniper by itself, but it should also be noted that this is a blend of both the alligator juniper and the shaggy bark juniper, and I have since thrown away all that gunpowder because once again I may have overcooked that. So once again, determine for yourself. I would say by comparison, there's a lot less little black pieces of carbon left behind, and the KN03 is at an absolute minimum. There is some chunks rubbing off, but not as easily as some of the other stuff was. See, when I rub it, some of it is still being left behind, which would obviously be left behind in your gun barrel. But I'm looking at the pieces of KN03 because, as I've mentioned before, you're using a charcoal for the fuel source, so you're going to get something left behind. I think on a plate glass, I think it gives us a better impression of what really is going on inside your gun barrels. But as I've mentioned before, on this channel, I can go 20-25 shots without having to clean my gun barrel out because I use a spit patch. Is that a difference? Well, for me it is. Alright, let me get another gunpowder set up for you. So here's that Siberian Elm. Well, on the plate glass, it doesn't look near as dirty as I thought it was. But once again, even in the smoky residue, I'm cleaning off an awful lot of soot, and I'm leaving an awful lot of soot behind if the camera can pick it up. And you can see that the chunks of carbon left behind are pretty large in size, but you guys determine that for yourself. All right, I'm going to clean it off and move on to the next one. Blended gunpowder Alder Cherry. Well, if you guys can see what's left behind, KN03 is very minute, like everything else, but there's not a whole lot of carbon left behind, is there? I mean, there is some left behind, yes, but compared to some of the other ones through a clear glass, doesn't look all that dirty. But that's my opinion. You make up your own mind. All right, here's my peanut shell. Let's see if I have to eat a little bit of crow here. Well, once again, like everything else, the KN03 is very, very minute, and the charcoal isn't near as bad sticking to my finger as a lot of the other stuff was. I mean, it is there and it is present, but it's not near as bad some of the other stuff. But once again, you make up your own mind because you're on that side of the camera and I'm on this side. And I'm not being biased. I'm trying to be honest here, comparing all of these homemade gunpowders. So now I'm going to do peanut shell alder blended, and we'll see what the difference is. Once again, peanut shell alder blended. Now if you look at what's left behind, you can see that there's very little charcoal substance left behind, or at least I can. There's a lot of soot in the smoke itself. If you guys haven't noticed that, most of the soot that's coming off on my finger is in the smoke. But you can see on the glass what's actually left behind as far as what people would consider a contaminant. It's not really a whole lot. Okay, so moving on. Now, grapevine. I certainly hope the sun's not interfering with what you guys are looking at. But as you can see, there's not a whole lot of carbon left behind on the glass. There's a lot of smoke, obviously. You can see that. And once again, most of the, like everything else, most of the carbon that's left behind is in the smoke. It's not so much what's on the glass as it is of what is in the smoke, which should help you to appreciate by far and large what was stated, or if I forgot to state, only 43% of your volume of gunpowder is being turned into gases. The rest of it's being left behind as fouling, or being thrown out the front of your barrel and being burnt and consumed as it drops to the ground. All right, moving on to two more. So here's Mullen. I would say, but you make up your own mind, that's pretty clean burning in comparison to some of the others. Once again, if you guys can see, I know the angle of the sun's wrong, but all the soot that's left behind truly is in the smoke, which is being pushed out of your gun barrel. But as far as what's truly left behind on the glass, as far as carbon, it's pretty minimal as far as I'm concerned. But once again, you friends make up your own mind, okay? I'm just giving you something in the way of food for thought. All right, now I'm going to burn 20 grains of GoX. All right, so I can tell you, from my perspective, there's a lot of little pieces of KNO3 left behind. There really is. But by comparison to some of my homemade stuff, I'm not getting as much left behind in the smoky residue. And as you can see, a lot of it's still left behind on the glass. At least I can hope you can see it. Like I said, the sun is just about right to be wrong for any of this. All right, I'm going to do one more test. And I'm going to really compare the difference between Swiss 3F and this GoX 3F. All right, the pile on the left, 20 grains of GoX. The pile on the right, 20 grains of Swiss. From here, they both look about the same. So let me get you close up. This is the Swiss. This is the GoX. You can see, I hope, that the Swiss is a lot more cloudier looking, if I can get it to where you guys can really see it. At least from this side of the glass it looks that way. And as far as the KNO3, they pretty much look about the same. The little white specks left behind. Now, if Captain Smith was determining clean or dirty gunpowder based on what was left behind in the clean glass, I would say that both Goex and Swiss are dirty gunpowders, according to his interpretation. But let's see if I can look at the finger once I scrape it off. And how does the finger look? You can see that a lot more of the charcoal is left behind on the glass, which means it probably burned a little hotter, because it took me a little longer to clean this off with acetone than it did the previous gunpowders. There's the finger. There's a lot of soot left behind, but once again, the soot is coming from the smoke left behind. All right, let me clean the finger off and I'll do the Swiss. It's just as equally dirty. It really is. Hope you guys can see that. And hopefully you guys can see, what's actually left behind on the glass. I know it's kind of difficult with the way everything's positioned, but I thought we could get a better look at this outside than in my dark shop. So quite honestly, there's not much difference between Swiss and Goex as far as cleanliness or dirtiness. They both left, in my opinion, behind large amounts of KNO3 and large amounts of smoky residue. But when you rub your finger through the smoke, which is being what's deposited in your gun barrel, it's pretty dirty. It's pretty dirty. All right, I'll go inside and give you my final analogy. So in conclusion, I want to read what he writes about efficiency of black powder. Black powder is notoriously inefficient. When it burns, the majority of the products of combustion are solids, not gases. In fact, generally speaking, only about 43% of the substances produced in the chemical reaction of burning black powder are hot, expansive propellant gases. The other 57% are solids, and most of the solids are blown out of the muzzle. See some of the solids in the form of smoke. See, we see the smoke, but as any black powder shooter knows, an awful lot of dang stuff remains behind in the barrel, and this is known as fouling. So for all the work to make black powder with pure ingredients, the best charcoal, careful and deliberate mixture and incorporation and pressing to just the right densities, we still only get 43% of what we actually want out of it. A hot, expansive gas builds up rapidly at high pressure to drive the bullet down the barrel. Another kick in the teeth, the roughly 57% of solid byproducts, almost 40 grains, assuming a powder charge of 48 grains, get added to the weight of the bullet. And the propellant gas formed not only has to push a 530 grain bullet, assuming a P53 Enfield being fired, but also has to push 40% more grains of worthless crap as well. This increases felt recoil and reduces the useful amount of energy of the powder can do. Alright, so he tells you, and I just read, he uses a 68 grain charge. And he's telling you that 50% of it is left behind in the form of smoke and fouling. And he makes a good valid point. Not only is the black powder trying to consume itself, and we all should know and recognize that black powder pushes as it burns. So you're also pushing whatever that grain charge that's left unburned or remaining in the form of smoke or soot also has to be incorporated in your thought process of pushing out whatever grain weight your ball is. So anyhow, friends, my battery's running low, so I want to thank you for watching, and I hope that this just gives you, friends, more food for thought when it comes to making your homemade black powder. There is no such thing as the cleanest of the cleanest milling it for 50 hours to get a clean gunpowder, or milling it for 20 hours to get a clean gunpowder. In my case, milling it for 30 to 36 hours. Get a cleaner burn? No. But what it does do is it helps incorporates the sulfur, the potassium nitrate, and the charcoal in a much better combination. And that's all it really does. Because you're still going to leave crap behind. But how big, in my case, are those pieces of KNO3? Very, very minute. In fact, you would almost have to have a magnifying glass just to see them. Whereas you look at people who, or when I've done my burn test, you look at gunpowder that's been milled for 12 hours, 18 hours, you can readily see the larger pieces of KNO3 and some of the other crap that's still left behind. So anyhow, friends, take it with a grain of salt. I still have a little bit of warm coffee. I want to thank you for watching, and I bid everybody adieu and have a great day. Bye.